Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today lectures I am going to explain about supervenience and emergentism, or emergentism and supervenience. How the emergentism and supervenience goes together, at the same time there are some differences, and how the emergence theory of mind explaining the concept of mind, at the same time how the supervenience thesis explaining the concept of mind. As we know that emergentism think as a theory of mind which is part of non-computational view of mind, non-mechanistic view of mind. That is the main aim in this lecture to show. Now, the question is, what is emergentism? According to emergentism, the higher level of quality emerges from the low level of existence and has its root therein, but it emerges therefrom, and it does not belong to that level, but it gives rise to a new order of existence with special laws. But whereas Samuel Alexander, who is the founder of this emergentist thesis, and he says that the higher level of quality emerges from the low level of existence and has its root therein, but it emerges from, but it does not belong to low level, but constitutes, it possesses a new order of existence with its special laws of behavior. The existence of emergent qualities thus described is something to be noted as, some would say, under the conclusion of brute empirical facts, or as we should prefer to say in less harsh terms, to be accepted with the natural pity of the investigators. It admits no explanations. Here emergence refers to the fact that in the course of evolution new things and events occur with unexpected and unpredicated properties. Things and events are new in the sense in which a great work of art may be described as a new thing. Every genuine emergence introduces novelty in the world. To say that an emergent characteristic is a novel means, firstly, it is not simply a rearrangement of pre-existing elements, although such rearrangements may be one of its determining conditions. Secondly, the characteristics is qualitatively, not just quantitatively, unlike anything that existed before in history. Thirdly, it is unpredictable not only on the basis of knowledge available prior to its emergence, but even on the basis of ideally complete knowledge of the state prior to its emergence. These points permits a distinction to be made between what is new in the sense of being a fresh combination of old factors and what is novel in the sense of being qualitatively unique and unpredictable. In this lectures, we will find out how consciousness emerges from mental properties and how the emergent properties of consciousness cannot be explained in a functional or computational way. Some philosophers argue that consciousness might be an emergent property in the sense that it is still compatible with materialism. It is also often held that emergent properties are unpredictable from lower level properties. However, it can be argued that these properties are new in an ontological sense. What is interesting about these properties is that they are not obvious consequence of the low level properties, but they are still causally supervenient on the low level of facts. Following the above arguments, we can put that the phenomena of consciousness could rise only in the presence of some non-computational physical processes taking place in the brain. As we know, living human brains are ultimately composed of the same material satisfying the same physical laws as are the inanimate objects of the universe. There is the Cartesian view that consciousness arises only in humans and that animals are inanimate automata, a view which is clearly pre-evolutionary. And we have reason to accept the view that there are lower and higher states of consciousness. Moreover, the most reasonable view seems to be that consciousness is an emergent property of animals arising under the pressure of natural selections. If this is so, then the questions are like this, that how does consciousness arises from antecedent conditions in the physical universe? This question is still unanswered. Even if the observation of the behavior of the amoeba created the strong impression that it is conscious, and we can find symptoms of activity and initiative in its behavior. That activity and behavior is something different from what happens in the neurons. The human brain is estimated to have 10,000 millions of neurons. There are also thousands of synaptic relations among the neurons, but the qualities which exist in the consciousness are not found in the neural relations. There is a new emergent entity in consciousness which did not exist in the neurons, because the emergent properties of consciousness are ontologically new. The problem of emergence in this context starts with life, and it should be remembered that brain is just a piece of inanimate matter, but a part of the living body. As Dayakrishna remarks, it is not even clear whether those who want to deny the reality of consciousness want to deny the reality of life also. The body they talk about is a living body. The brain, they are found of the brain that is alive. Take life away and everything dies, ceases. At least live it and feel it and know it. Here Dayakrishna is trying to identify life with consciousness. Here, like consciousness, life also emerges from human body and identify consciousness. In fact, the problem of emergence of life is a far wider one, but here we are concerned with human life only, because the question is that why is it that the phenomena of consciousness appears to occur as far as we know only in living beings, although we should not rule out the possibility that consciousness might be present also in other appropriate physical systems. The second question is, how could it be that such a seemingly ingredient as non-computational behavior, presumed to be inherent in the actions of all material things, so far has entirely escaped the notice of physicists? The first question is that the question is related with the subtle and complex organization of the brain, but that alone could not provide a sufficient explanation. Penrose clearly maintains that, I quote, "I am contending that the faculty of human understanding lies beyond any computational schemes, whatever, if it is microtubules that control the activity of the brain, and then there must be something within the action of microtubules that is different from mere computations." Unquote. Here he says that this inanimate matter is microtubules that control the activity of the brain. because there is life in it, that is in the brain. The actions of microtubules is different from mere computations, because he points out that such actions are non-computational actions in which life is related to consciousness. The above statement leads to the question, is there any evidence that the phenomena of consciousness is related to the action of microtubules? In particular, it must also be the case that the detailed neural organization of the brain is fundamentally involved in growing what from that consciousness must take. For Penrose, if that organization were not important, then our lives would evoke as much consciousness as do our brains. Here he put it like this: what the preceding argument strongly suggests is that it is not just a neural organization of our brain that is important. The cytoskeletal underpinning of those very neurons seems to be essential for consciousness to be present, unquote. But it is not the cytoskeleton as such that is relevant, but some essential physical actions that biology has so cleverly contrived to incorporate into the activity of its microtubules. Moreover, it may be pointed out that in our brain there is an enormous organization, and since consciousness appears to be a very global feature of our thinking, it seems that we must look to some kind of coherence on a much larger than that level of single microtubules or even single cytoskeletons. And there is some kind of useful non-computational actions involved, which Penrose takes to be an essential part of consciousness. Secondly, we must expect that vestiges of such non-computational should also be present at some reasonable levels in inanimate matter, but yet the physics of ordinary matter seems to allow no room for such non-computational behavior. Jagan Kim is one of the famous founder of supervenience thesis. In his book on supervenience and in his article on supervenience, he argued that there is a strikingly similarity between emergence and supervenience. According to Kim, the higher level properties, notable consciousness and other mental properties emerge when and only when an appropriate set of low level or basal conditions are present. And this means that the occurrence of the higher properties is determined by and dependent on the instantiation of appropriate low level properties and relations. In spite of this, emergent properties were held to be genuinely novel, characteristically irreducible to the lower level processes from which they emerge, unquote. Then the concept of emergence combines the three components of supervenience delineated above, namely property covariance, dependence and non-reducibility. Thus, emergentism can be regarded as the first systematic formulation of non-reductive physicalism. This thesis makes the mental life supervenient on its physical background. That is to say, according to this thesis, the mental states are not reducible to, but are supervenient on the physical state in such a way that whatever changes take place in the physical states must make a difference to the mental states. Well, no two things could differ in a mental respect unless they differ in some physical respect. That is, imperceptibility with respect to physical properties entails indiscriminability with respect to mental properties. That is the core idea of mind body supervenience. Thus, supervenience thesis understood in the strong sense that it makes rooms for a nomological dependence of the mental on the physical, such that the physical states are necessarily responsible for the mental states. As Kim points out that the mental is dependent on the physical, but not vice versa, because the mental states are directly a consequence of the physical states. The mental states themselves do not determine the physical states. In that sense, the mental states remains nomological dependent on the physical universe. In his article on the non-reductionistic troubles with mental conditions, and he mentions that the non-reductive physicalism consists of following theses. Firstly, all concrete particulars are physical. Secondly, mental properties are not reducible to physical properties. Thirdly, all mental properties are physically realized, that is, whenever an organism or system instances a mental phenomena M, there is a physical property P such that P realizes in M in organism of its kind. Fourthly, mental properties are real properties of the objects and events. They are not merely useful aids in making predications or fictitious manners of speech. Therefore, we find that these four basic tenets bring non-reductive physicalism very close to emergentism. In fact, the non-reductive physicalism of this variety is best viewed as a form of emergentism. Emergentists in general accepted purely materialistic ontology of concrete physical objects and events. For example, Samuel Alexander is one of the principal theoreticians of emergent schools, argues that there are mental events over and above neural processes. Alexander says, we thus becomes aware partly by experience, partly by reflections, that processes with the distinct quality of mind or consciousness is in the same place and time with a neural processes, that is, with a highly differentiated and complex processes of our living body. We are forced therefore to go beyond the mere correlation of the mental with these neural processes and to identify them. There is but one process which, being of a specific complexity, has the quality of consciousness. It has then to be accepted as an empirical fact that a neural processes of a certain level of development process the quality of consciousness and is thereby mental processes, and alternatively a mental process is also a vital one of the certain order. However, emergent properties are irreducible to the physical conditions out of which they emerge is familiar. This irreducibility claim is constructive of the emergentist metaphysical worldview. Although the emergentist idea of reductions or reductive explanation diverges from the model of reduction implicit in current anti-reductionistic argument. The philosophical significance of the denial of reducibility between two property levels is the same. The higher level of properties being irreducible are genuinely new addition to ontology of this world. For example, Samuel Alexander says that out of certain physiological conditions, nature has framed a new quality mind, which is therefore not its physiological, though it lives and moves, and its being in physiological conditions. Hence, it is that there can be and is an independent science of psychology, and no physiological constellation explains for us why it should be mind. The strong supervenience thesis does not bridge the gap between mental and physical, because it fails to account for how the mental state with their qualitative content arise at all in a material environment. The gap between the physical and mental remains wide, because it is not known how the mental world can be explained. Now, the question is it not possible that the mental life not be there even if the physical universe exists perfectly? That is to say that there are possible worlds in which all the physical states of the present universe are there, but there is no conscious state at all. For example, robots behave like human beings, but lack consciousness. The behavior itself is not consciousness, and if consciousness is the same in all organisms like material things, then there will be no qualitative difference between the human and non-human. Therefore, we cannot prove that consciousness is supervenient on the physical world. John Searle has given an example which will make this thesis more legitimate. Let us see thesis. Suppose that we have a system S and the elements of systems are A, B, C. S might be a stone and the elements might be molecules. There will be features of S that are not or not necessary feature of A, B, C, but there are some features which are causally emergent system features like solidity, liquidity and transparency are example of causally emergent systems features. In these connections, we will remind us that life is an emergent property, and if there were no life, there would be no consciousness either. Here in the case of 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, we are getting water. The quality which are existing in 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, the same qualities are not in the water. For example, liquidity and solidity. What John Searle is making here, although John Searle is giving one kind of naturalistic theory of mind or consciousness, but in this naturalistic theory of consciousness, if you see that there is a differences, and in the case of emergence there is some kind of qualitative, may not be any kind of quantitative difference, but there is a qualitative difference, and this qualitative difference is sufficient in explaining that mind is different from the body and mind is different from the machines. As we know that water is the combination of 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, but there are qualitative differences between water on the one hand and the hydrogen and oxygen on the other hand. The qualities which we find in the water we will not find in the oxygen and hydrogen. In the same way, there is differences between consciousness and matter, because there is a qualitative difference between the two. The qualities which emerges from consciousness will not possible to explain in the mechanical or functional way, but it needs separate explanation, and its explanation is non-reductive explanation, that is self explanations. The above definition shows that consciousness is a causally emergent properties of systems. It is an emergent feature of creation system of neurons in the same way that solidity and liquidity are emergent features of the system of molecules. Thus, the existence of consciousness can be explained by the causal interactions between elements of the brain at the micro level, but consciousness cannot itself be deduced or calculated from the sheer physical structure of the neurons without some additional account of the causal relation between them. Now, the question is, why is consciousness an irreducible feature of physical reality? there is a standard argument to show that consciousness is not reducible in the way that material properties are reducible. For example, that I am now in pain, I am now in a certain consciousness state such as pain. Now, the question is, what fact in the world corresponds to my statement I am now in pain? Here is the fact that I have no certain unpleasant conscious sensation, and I am experiencing these sensations from my experiences. It is these sensations that are constitutively of my present pain, but the pain is also caused by certain underlying neurophysiological processes consisting in large part of patterns of neurons firing in my brain. It is like that I have a pain because there is a C fiber firing is happening in my physical systems, and therefore, there is identity between the C fiber firing and my pain experiences. But if we reduce the first person sensation of pain to the third pattern of neurons firing, then we try to say that the pain is really nothing but the patterns of neurons firings. If this is so, then we are leaving the essential feature of pain. No description of the third person type would convey the first person character of pain, because the first person features are different from the third person features. Thomas Nagel states that by contrasting the objectivity of the third person features with the what it is like to be features of the subjective experience, subjective state of consciousness. As Nagel says, I quote, conscious experience is a widespread phenomena. It occurs at many levels of animals' life, though we cannot be sure of its presence in the simple organisms, and it is very difficult to say in general what provides evidence of it. And no matter how the form may vary, the fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means basically that there is something it is like to be that organisms, but fundamentally an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. Thus, I know that I am in pain is a different sort of knowledge that my knowledge that you are in pain. The feeling of pain indicates that there is close relation between consciousness and self consciousness. This is due to the emergence of self consciousness out of consciousness, and thus making it a radical different from what is if it is at all human levels. But Dayakrishna remarks that the development of robotics denies the reality of consciousness because of this self consciousness. Knowledge have self determinations and deny the existence of mind or consciousness. This self consciousness has forgotten its dimension of knowing, feeling and willing. The last result in the transformations through technology that has obsessed the modern mind to such an extent that it has gone to the extent of denying its own reality and considering the matter alone as real. But yet matter, though resistant, is flexible, agreeable to change, which consciousness does not seem to be in the same sense. The denial of I consciousness, which is an inevitable accompaniment of self consciousness. The real causal role of consciousness, however, becomes clear when self consciousness comes into its own and discovers that it can directly affect consciousness and indirectly everything else through imagining, intending, thinking, attending, concentrating, reasoning and the other myriad activities which man has encountered in himself and developed through a long process. Therefore, from the above exploration, it follows that once consciousness emerges from physical properties, it will never be reduced to it. This shows that emergentism cannot support functionalism or computationalism, because a functionalist explains consciousness or mind in the reductive way, whereas an emergentist explains consciousness in a non-reductive way. Consciousness makes the mind-body problems really intractable. The reductionist shows that the mind-body problems is not a real problem. For him or her, there is no explanatory gap between mind and body. We have to find out why these arguments do not help us to understand the relations between mind and body. Without consciousness, the mind and body problems would be less interesting, but with consciousness, it seems hopeless. The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience special to first person character, which cannot be explained within a scientific framework. Cognitive science can explain a system function in terms of its internal mechanism, but it is not possible to explain what it is to have subjective experience, but it is not a problem about the performance of functions. Thomas Nagel says that conscious experience is a widespread phenomena. Fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like to be for the organism. In recent times, all sorts of mental phenomena have yielded as to scientific explanation, but consciousness has stubbornly resisted this explanation. Many philosophers and scientists have tried to explain it, but the explanation always seem to fall short of the target. Now, the question is, why is it so difficult to explain? According to David Chalmers, cognitive science has not explained why there is conscious experience at all, When we think and perceive, there is a way of information processing, but there are also subjective individual aspect of consciousness which goes beyond the information processing. He says that when it comes to conscious experience, this sort of explanation fails. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique is that it goes beyond problems about the performance of the functions. To see this, not that even when we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, perceptual descriptions, categorizations, internal access, verbal reports, there may still remain a further question: why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? According to David Chalmers, even if all the functions of a system are well articulated, there is further questions as to why there is an experience at all accompanying their functions. Cognitive science fails to explain why there is any experience at all, even though it explains all the brain functions. The hard problem of consciousness consists in the why questions regarding consciousness, but the question is why is the hard problem so hard and why are the easy problems so easy? The easy problems are easy because they are concerned the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. To explain an cognitive functions, we need a mechanism that can perform the functions. The cognitive sciences offers this type of explanations and so are well suited to the easy problem of consciousness. On the other hand, the hard problem is hard because it is not a problem about the performance of the functions. The problem persists even when the performance of all the relevant functions are explained. And he says that, I quote, I suggest that a theory of consciousness should take experience as fundamental. We know that a theory of consciousness requires the addition of something fundamental to our ontology, as everything in physical theory is compatible with the absence of consciousness. We might add some entirely new non-physical features from which experience can be derived, but it is hard to see what such a feature would be like. More like we will take experience itself as a fundamental feature of the world alongside mass, charge and space time. If we take experience as fundamental, then we can go about the business of constructing a theory of experience. Unquote. The reductionists have not solved the hard problem of consciousness, because as we have seen, it has explained consciousness only in terms of the easy problem of consciousness. Easy problems are all concerned with how a cognitive or behavioral function is performed. There are questions about how the brain carried out the cognitive tasks, that is, how it discriminates stimuli, integrate information and so on. Whereas the hard problem of consciousness goes beyond the problems about how functions are performed. If scientific view of mind tries to give a definite definition of consciousness, then it leaves out the explanatory gap, that is, there is no explanatory gap between mind and body, because there is no distinction between mind and body. Mind can be explained in terms of body, and there is nothing called the mind, since the mind itself is a part of the body, which we have already seen in the functionalistic model of mind and in the artificial intelligence model of mind. And if this is so, then it leaves out subjective experience and adopts for the third person perspective of consciousness. Consciousness makes the mind body problems really intractable. The reductionists deny that there is a mind body problem at all, for there is no explanatory gap between the mind and body, because there is no distinction between the mind and body. Mind can be explained in terms of body, and there is a nothing called the mind, since the mind itself is a part of the body. Therefore, for them, that the mind is reductively explainable in terms of body. On the other hand, many philosophers hold that mind cannot be explainable in terms of body. But as we have seen that there is subjective quality which is makes the distinction between mind and the body, and this subjective includes emergent biological properties such as life. The essence of body is spatial extensions. The essence of mind is thought, as we have seen in the Cartesian concept of mind. Thought is taken to be defining attributes of mind, which is an incorporeal substance, a substance that is non-spatial in the nature. The term thought, we can understood everything which we are argue as for the happening within us, insofar as we have awareness of it. What follows from Descartes' view is that consciousness is essentially a first person subjective phenomenon, and conscious states cannot be reduced or eliminated into the third persons. Therefore, it is consciousness which makes the explanatory gap between the first person and third person perspective. According to the Cartesian concept of mind, we have access to the contents of our own minds in a way denied to us in respect to matter. There is something special about our own knowledge of our own mind that naturally goes with the Cartesian view. But if you see especially some other argument are the mental life with its qualia cannot be nomenologically determined by the physical conditions of the universe. The following are the reason of the thesis that the mental life is independent of the physical body, although they coexist. Firstly, the qualia of the mental state cannot be reproduced in an artificial machines like a robot or a machine's table. They are unique to the person concerned. The qualia are the essence of consciousness and so must be intrinsic to the conscious subject. Thus, there is one kind of intelligibility gap between the qualia and the physical world remains, as the qualia are understood widely as belong to the conscious subject. Consciousness makes the gap between mind and body and the subjectivity, and it is most troublesome features. Self is a subject which encompasses our feeling, thinking and perception. The qualitative character of consciousness is what it is like to be subjective, to have the experiences. But conscious experience is as we have seen is one kind of wide spread phenomena, and this conscious experience is very difficult to explain in a mechanistic way. It is because of the emergence of consciousness make one kind of strong distinction between mind and body and mind and machines. Therefore, the subjectivity cannot be explained reductively. It is not analyzed in terms of any explanatory system of functional states or intentional states, since they could not be ascribed to robots or automata that behaved like people, though they experienced nothing. There is subjective feeling attached to our conscious experience, because subjective feeling are the outcome of consciousness experience. That is, consciousness itself cannot be established simply on the basis of what we observe about the brain and its physical effects. We cannot explain which property of the brain accounts consciousness and distinct cognitive properties, namely perceptions and interpretations, necessarily mediate our relationship with the brain and with consciousness. We cannot understand how the subjective aspect of experience depends upon the brain, that it is really the problem. Therefore, consciousness is the essential subjectivity, and that is not the mechanical, as many philosophers believe that it is I or subject who is experiencing, and it is the I is the subject which is emerges from the biological systems are concerned, and consciousness is essential, therefore, is essential subjectivity. The term pain is subjective, as it is not accessible to any observable, because it is the first person perspective. For example, I have a pain in my leg. In this case, the statement is completely subjective. The pain is itself has the subjective model of existence. As Searle says that conscious states exist only when they are experienced by some human or animal subject. In that sense, they are essential subjectivity. I used to treat subjectivity and qualitativeness as distinct feature, but it is now seems to me that properly understood. Qualitativeness and subjectivity, because there is this qualitative and subjectiveness making one kind of difference. If there is no subjectivity, no experiences, and this qualitative experiences can exist only in experienced by some subjects. Because conscious states are subjective, in the sense it is legitimate to hold that there is a first person ontology as opposed to the third person ontology, and this first person ontology emerges from the one kind of emergent properties, and that makes the differences between in the mind and body, and that establish the distinction between the emergent thesis and supervenience thesis. Although, but this is a one kind of naturalistic emergent thesis, but still it makes a sufficient distinction between the emergentism and supervenience thesis, because supervenience thesis, as we have seen, is that they have been arguing that there is close, or there is a kind of close interaction with mind and body, and mind can be explainable in terms of body, and body can be explainable in terms of mind. But in the case of emergentist, there is mind is emergence, the subjective qualities and conscious experience emerges from the physical object, but it has its own identity. And these are the main theses of emergentism and supervenience thesis. Thank you very much.